Session with Dr. Farid Holakouee.
Good afternoon. Welcome to In Session. I'm your host, Dr. Farid Holakouee, and I'll be with you for the next 2 hours here on Radio Hamra. There is a lot on people's minds these days, thinking about Iran, thinking about, there's this agreement that maybe has been reached, and people have lots of ideas about it. I haven't even read, I don't know if it's been released, the actual full agreement, but I've not read it myself. But so, as always, our thoughts are with the people of Iran who often, at the end of the day, get forgotten in all of this. The governments try to get what they want, but generally, the people of Iran don't get what they want. And that's also a big part of that is because their government, the Islamic Republic, is not trying to take care of them or doing what is best for them in so many ways, and trying to maintain power rather than take care of them. And an extension of all this is the World Cup is happening right now, and it is quite interesting circumstances, to say the least, for Iran, who is a country who has been at war with the United States, to then be playing in a World Cup where one of the host countries is the United States and is hosting their matches, the first two being in Los Angeles and the third one in Seattle. And so there's always politics involved internationally, but here it's been very, very front and center for a lot of people in so many ways. There's what's happening between Iran and the US, which is huge. And then there's, that led to visa issues for the team and staff, and even the team stationing themselves in Tijuana, Mexico, instead of Los Angeles, all sorts of things of that nature. Also, the people of Iran. And, for me, that was something that it's not clear, because there's a sense of, will this team represent the people of Iran, or will this team represent the government of Iran? And obviously, there's no official stance, but my sense more and more is it's more about the government than the people. Even, at least one player, Osman, was not put on the roster for really what seems like no other reason other than some political comments he's made. A photo I think he took with some leaders in Dubai, and also his criticism of the government or his support of the women life freedom movement 4 years ago. So that itself is definitely not a good sign, and shows that even the choice of the players is not even for the team, it's for the government, or for political reasons, or preferences at the minimum. And that doesn't look very good to me at all. But I've talked a lot on the show about mixed feelings, and how in most things in life, we don't just feel one pure thing, like pure sadness, pure anger, pure happiness. Generally, things are much more complex and mixed than that. And that's something I have been feeling about this situation when it comes to the Iranian team Melli, and how to either support, not support, be against. Are you against the team? Are you against the players? Do you want them to win? Do you want them to lose? To me, it's not something I could say very clearly. I felt so strongly one side or the other. I definitely wanted to watch the game, and I did. Not only to watch the game, I was actually even more curious to see before the game, and also to see the national anthem, especially, and to see the fans and the crowd, and to see what the reactions were like. One thing I feel fairly certain about watching the game, and having watched many of the other matches so far in this World Cup, was that the camera seemed not to show people almost at all during the national anthem. Definitely not close up. It was stayed kind of on the field and the players, which it always does, but then it almost always shows some shots of the fans, passionately, singing along, some even getting emotional, or things of that sort. You'll always see that. But in this match, I get the sense FIFA was concerned of what they would see in the crowd, and so they didn't show the crowd very much, definitely during the national anthem and also throughout the game. There was some close-up shots, and even that I think was telling, that it was almost like they'd find a person or just someone that it would be more innocuous and have a zoomed in shot on an Iranian fan. But I could see, as I'm sure many of you, the pre-revolution flag in the stadium, even on TV, not zoomed in, but you could see it in the background. You could definitely see the lion and sun in the background in many of the shots. But it was interesting for me that there were almost no close-up shots of the fans, and I think they knew why. They try to keep politics out of things. I'm sure the Islamic Republic, being one of the countries represented, talks to FIFA, and they probably are aware of the potential for those, for things to be put out there, people's signs and flags and things of that sort. FIFA itself made the very controversial decision not allowing the flag, or saying they would ban the flag, which then was met with lots of backlash, and which I think was the right thing. And also, then I heard in some ways they said they couldn't do that. It was a bit complicated. Whatever it was, many people had the flag in the stadium, which I was happy to see. And even attending the game became like a divisive issue. Should you attend the game or should you not? And I could see both sides of the coin. On one side, I could feel like if you go, you're supporting the team, and in that way supporting the government, and that doesn't sound good. And I can get that. And I myself grappled with this. I did not go. I've always wanted to go to a World Cup match, but I never have. And this would have seemed like the perfect opportunity. Iranian team playing in Los Angeles, but with everything going on, I didn't want to go because I thought it was not the right thing for me personally to do. But I saw so many people commenting on, are they going to go, not going to go? What does it mean to go? And, all those kinds of things. So yes, it could be seen as supporting the regime by supporting the team or even attending. Of course, there was protests outside the stadium too, so that was its own option. But as far as attending goes, I also could understand that if no one who was against the regime went to the match, then what possibly would have been seen in the stadium is a very pro-regime feeling, and it would give the impression that people are very for the regime because no one seems to be against it, or no one has, let's say, other flags or things going on. So there could also be this sense that showing up would allow someone to voice their opposition with the regime, so protest in its own way. It's all very complicated about something that's so simple like sports, which at the end of the day doesn't matter compared to anything else, or these things we're talking about. It's so minor, but it often becomes a way of things being politicized. It also could be a way of sports washing, another thing that people are accusing the regime of, trying to make it, well, this is the national team, so everyone should support them, and so there shouldn't be any negativity there. There should be full support, but people have their issue with that too. So I watched with a very almost heavy heart, conflicted about the whole thing, about what would I even want to happen. I wasn't really quite sure, because I also feel that if the Iranian team even goes a little bit further, maybe that keeps Iran in the spotlight further, and maybe that brings more even good attention, or maybe negative attention to the regime, but just keeps Iran more in the public eye. Because a concern I have is, this agreement happens, the war is quote unquote over. Let's see, I know parts of the ceasefire are about, or part of the agreement is 60 days, things of that sort. So who knows what's going to happen, but it could just be that all eyes are removed, or no longer are looking at Iran and the people of Iran, and they are left to just face the consequences of everything that's happened, and maybe even things would be worse off than they were before. Don't really know if that would happen, but that would be my concern. So I even have mixed feelings of the Iranian team possibly winning. Not that I want them to win or support the regime, but could that be in some way keeping Iran on the spotlight in some ways? And that might not be a bad thing. That could actually be a good thing. So there's that side of things too that I see or consider or am aware of, which makes me even more conflicted. That just them losing it won't necessarily maybe accomplish anything either. Maybe it's good if they win a little bit and, let's say go to the next round and, um, you know, keep things on them or keep the attention on them. I also, for the players, I can't speak for every single one of them because there's so many of them, or speak about every one of them. And I don't know, some of them maybe have used political things or are against the regime in some way or for the regime, or they can have different positions. I do feel bad for them in some ways too. These are professional athletes, and this is the pinnacle of the competition of the sport that they play. And they have to go into it always, last World Cup, just like this World Cup, with this turmoil surrounding them and these mixed feelings about, what it means to support the team or be on the team or play for the team. And that's really tough. And maybe that's why Iran underperformed by all just objective standards, that New Zealand being, I think, the lowest ranked team in the World Cup, according to FIFA's rankings, and Iran being, I think, somewhere around the 20s compared to New Zealand being 85. You would have expected Iran to win the game, but they didn't play their best game. They did come back twice, being down 1-0 and then 2-1, but still probably needed to win that game or should have won that game, and they didn't. So these players are put in a tough spot. Also, everything that happened with their visas, moving their camp from LA to Mexico, and they have to travel to the games and back. It's obviously far from ideal circumstances, and I can imagine that impacted them as well. That puts some kind of more pressure on them or more strain on them, and that's kind of what they were dealing with. So it was tough for me. As I said, watching, I think the mixed feelings is something that many Iranians felt about the whole situation, and I think I felt that way as well. And I saw another thing I'll say, I did see many videos online posted of tension between fans, some even in the stadium, but many of them outside of the stadium. People saying very, very mean, harsh things for one another. And I understand things are very intense and passionate. And when people see the flag of the Islamic Republic, someone wearing it, and it seems like they're supporting it, that can be very upsetting and angering. I can get that. What I saw that I didn't like was sometimes even, someone might be with their children and people were cursing at, someone who was with their kids because they had a jersey that had the flag, or something of that sort, where I understand the anger, and I'm not saying we should not call things out, or, we can tell someone if they're supporting something that's not right. But, doing it in front of kids, using foul language, creating a very aggressive, tense scene for these young children doesn't do anything positive. It's not going to help the people of Iran, in my opinion. And all you're doing is creating potentially traumatic moment for these young children. So I saw a lot of this tension and clashes outside of the stadium, and I can get it when we have so much anger about what's going on, and then you see someone who might be supporting that. You want to take out that anger, but I think we can at times think twice on what is the benefit, or what does that do at the end of the day. So we'll see what happens. Their next game is on Sunday versus Belgium, and we'll also see politically what's going to happen. I'm also just curious again to watch the match, to watch the game itself, but everything outside of the match too, the fans, the reaction to the national anthem. Definitely heard some boos in there. I also wondered if they're going to mute some of the audio from the fans so that we don't hear as many of the boos, because I heard in the stadium it was even louder, the boos, but again, it's hard to verify these things or to know what's going on. But we'll see what happens. And most importantly, this is just about a game of football or soccer. It's not very important. What's most important is the people of Iran, who are still yearning for freedom and to be able to have all their rights and to be taken care of. That's the most important thing of all of this, which I hope does not get forgotten. Let's go to our first commercial break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Today is June 19th, and here in the United States for the last 5 years, I think it is, June 19th has been a nationally recognized holiday, Juneteenth. but it's been celebrated for many years in certain communities. And what Juneteenth commemorates, or June 19th, is the, well, I wouldn't say the abolishment of slavery in a way it is, but the ending of slavery in the United States on June 19th, 1865, which was about 2 months after the war had ended, or the Confederacy, the Southern states had ended the war, or surrendered. Uh, Finally, word reached to the state of Texas that slavery had ended. The Emancipation Proclamation was actually written in January 1st, 1863. But even with the war ending, it took a few months for slavery to actually end. Of course, we're talking about a time way before electronic communication that we have now. So a word could spread very slowly, and unfortunately, when the people in power don't want a message to be spread or shared, they're obviously not going to want that to spread. And so the slave owners did not want for this, to lose slavery because of the advantages it gave them. And so we do see that slavery ended really June 19th, 1865, which is it should be a celebrated holiday. It's actually a controversial one. Uh, some people don't think it should have been a holiday, or that we shouldn't include it or make it a national holiday. But nonetheless, in 1865, there were still about 250,000 enslaved people in Texas. So 250,000 people were still in slavery, even years after the Emancipation Proclamation, but even months after the war had ended. And, when I think about issues related to racism in the United States, it's a topic I've covered so many times because I think it's a really important one that people think of as, well, we're kind of past that, or it no longer exists, or even this 1865, 61 years ago, that's a long time. That impact is gone or is no longer there, and I don't think that's true. And I think anyone looking at the United States objectively would tell you, or would look at things and see that we don't have the end of racism here. It still does exist. Doesn't mean it's the same as it was before. No. Does it mean things haven't gotten better? No, things have gotten better. Things definitely have progressed. But things getting better and progressing doesn't mean something has totally stopped, or things are totally good or can't get better. And when I look at the United States, I sometimes think of how slavery, which existed in other countries as well, of course, it was around the world, but just looking at the United States, I think that the way that war being fought over it, and the ways that it was literally subjugating people, a huge portion of the population. And then imagine when one day you go from not being a slave to being freed. Sometimes there's this, of course, that's a big deal. That's monumental. And I don't want to undermine that, how important that was. But also we can imagine, now trying to be part of everyday society, or being treated not as a slave or as equal citizens. Definitely didn't happen overnight. And I think it's still unfolding to some degree. But, how difficult it still was for those Black Americans who were formerly slaves to now try to live, or try to create a life and to be able to function in society. So, but what I was going to say is that I don't think we dealt with slavery ending well in the United States. There wasn't some sense of fixing or righting the wrong, and there's many books, about what happened afterwards, and then Jim Crow happening many years later, but kind of these backlashes, what maybe Black progress was happening, the backlashes that took place to push Black people back down in the United States. But one thing that comes to my mind is that there's no resolution or no clear, let's put this almost like a relational terms, like a sense of reconciliation, apology, acknowledgement, and trying to resolve the issue. There wasn't some sense that things were made right, and I think that leaves a mark or leaves a tension that is still there. And that's something that I think you observe in the United States, is that things have not been made right. We still have um, to make up for those wrongs that happened many, many years ago. And so people will say, well, why would we have to do anything now? Or why should we have to sacrifice for it now? Um, but the difference is, even if you haven't done something wrong, if wrong has been done and people have suffered, that still has to be made right. Um, and that's something that I don't think we have done in the United States. And we have not made it right. We have not had reconciliation. We have not had acknowledgement of the damage and the pain, and we have not made things right, even at a financial level. That has not happened. And so, how do we make things right? There's no way to take away wrong. There's no way to um, make it never happen, and there's no way to make it perfectly right. Even you'll hear about reparations, some way of paying financially, giving some kind of financial payment of some sort to Black Americans because of slavery. And what's I should note, that I think does make sense to do. But what's shocking is you'll see in many countries when slavery ended, and this is just, I think, shows how much we too much prioritize property and ownership, to the fact that even someone owning a person can be seen in this way. But when slavery was ended, very often it wasn't that the slaves were given money to, as an apology for what they have endured, this unspeakable reality of being owned by someone else, which is just that a person being owned by someone else is something that's completely unacceptable. But actually, slaveholders were paid, because it was like, okay, you are losing some private property. I mean, it's even shocking or appalling to even say, but because you're losing some private property, you should be paid for that. You're being paid for that property that you've lost property, lost, damages. Really, it's really shocking. In the United States, that it didn't happen in effect because of the Civil War and the damage that cost. It was almost like, well, this is cost enough, or you already cost enough, or that might not make sense. But it is really something shocking that you see in many countries, that when slavery was ended, the slaveholders were actually paid to try to make things right because they were losing private property. So yeah, really, really shocking and horrific, but that has been the reality. So because sometimes when you talk about these things, people will bring up, well, other countries have done this or that. And of course, we can look to other countries as examples to try to see what has worked, what hasn't. Of course, recognizing that country to country situation, the situation might be different, but still we can learn lessons from one another and learn lessons from history. I am focusing more on the United States, because that's what I'm talking about today, and what they can do, or what might happen here. But when we talk about reparations, sometimes people will. A big thing I think that comes up, and I think at some level it's an excuse, is kind of like, well, how do you do it? How much do you give? Who gets it? Why should I be taxed for it? All these kinds of things. And yes, I would obviously agree that it's very, very much an imperfect type of a thing. There's no clear way to do it, clean way to do it. Who should get what? How much? Does it matter if you were both of your parents' lineage, were slaves or not, or there's so many questions that could come up, and then that can make people say, well, it's just too complicated, so just that we should just forget it. But that's not really a good way of dealing with things. Almost everything is imperfect. I mean, if you look at something so different, but insurance, types of things. Well, yeah, sometimes people don't get what they deserve, or they get more than they deserve, or someone should get something they don't get, or payments are made for something, and things are almost never going to be clean. It's not the same, but even I think part of what's happening with the U.S. and Iran is the U.S. is going to be, I think, sending, or somehow Iran will be getting $300 billion, or some large sum of money, and part of that is to as almost like reparations because of the damages from the war, to rebuild their country. And so obviously that's also imperfect, and in all those things, this is between adversarial countries, but still, it's going to be imperfect, but it's just, okay, this is something that's done, and we try to do the best that we can. So almost this idea of we can't do it perfectly, so we shouldn't do it at all is almost like a cop out to just say, well, I don't want to even like deal with it because it's saying it's just too complicated, so we shouldn't do anything at all. And I'm not even saying that's going to solve things or fix things. I think it could be one thing that has an impact. We do see that Black families, when you look at wealth, they are very much still at a disadvantage in many ways, and so financially making things right would make a difference. But it's not just that. I don't think just if a payment would be made, that everything would be okay. The payment itself would be part of an acknowledgement of the wrong that was done. This free labor that was people were used and abused and literally killed and mutilated and hurt in so many ways on top of that. So it's some way of acknowledging the wrongdoing. And this is obviously different from a relationship, between, let's say, two people or family members. But when you look at family members or just, any kind of close relationship, if someone does something that hurts the other person, if there isn't a sense of acknowledgement and apology and working through what happened, that relationship sometimes will never be the same again, or won't be as good as it can be. Compared to if there is some sense of reconciliation, acknowledgement of the pain, the wrongdoing, apology, trying to make things right. So even small things of saying something someone doesn't like or that was hurtful, or forgetting something, or doing something that maybe is a little bit bigger but still small compared to what we're talking about here in relation to slavery, that can damage a relationship, and that damage continues as it can keep going. It doesn't mean, well, it happened 5 years ago, so it doesn't impact the relationship now. It can continue to impact the relationship forever, as long as that relationship keeps going, unless it is resolved. And so, to me, looking at what's happened in the United States, you still see that there is this lack of resolution, lack of reconciliation, making things right, which will be messy, which will be something unclear, which will be something that can't be done perfectly. There's no such thing as perfectly, which is something that even doing it doesn't mean, yes, we've done it and now it's done and everything is perfect. So something like that, but it's part of a process, or trying to work towards something to make things better. So today is Juneteenth. You can also yourself look into and look up the history about this holiday, and understanding its significance and its significance in the Black community, and why it makes sense to have that be a national holiday for all Americans, not just for Black Americans. But the ending of slavery, as an American, I am appalled that we had slavery, and I'd be appalled if anything close to that existed. So you would celebrate, or at least want to commemorate, the day that no longer exists or is no longer part of that country, or part of your country. So it could be something worth looking at. But I do think the sense of trying to understand, if America wants to fully move forward, you could say, yes, it was so long ago, but when things don't get resolved, when things don't get worked out and moved through, the damage continues. And I think we do see that here in the United States. All right, let's go to another commercial break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. And the last time I was talking about Juneteenth and was mentioning how I think in the United States there hasn't been a reconciliation of what happened, even if it was more than 150, 160 years ago with slavery, the ending of slavery, and even what happened afterwards. It's not like after slavery, everything was good, as I was talking about. In this segment, I want to continue on that theme of reconciliation, bringing it back to relationships, so smaller scale types of things, but what happens in individual relationships, or family relationships, romantic relationships, and the important role that apologies can play. I know there's like some kind of quote, I don't know if it's from a movie or it's a quote that true love is never having to say I'm sorry, and I can get that in a way. There's a sense that when you truly love and know one another, then even someone does something that it might hurt or might hurt you in that moment, you kind of know or understand them, or know that they love you and you love them, and might not hurt or you'll be able to brush it off. I think it's more of it's something that sounds sweet, but not something that's complete. It's often the case with these kinds of phrases. They carry some meaning, but they're not comprehensive or they're 100% true. But I do think, generally speaking, and in real relationships, apologies are part of what makes them work. And what is a bigger problem is not too many apologies, it's too few apologies. And the problem with, if we're talking about too many apologies, would be if they're not genuine. So anything that's not genuine likely is not going to be helpful in any way, but to a relationship. So yeah, there are people that apologize too much. A people pleaser, for example, might do that. They almost might even use it as a defense that because I'm apologizing before, or apologizing so profusely, you can't be upset with me. Also, public apologies. That's been something that we've seen so many people making these public apologies that feel very, very disingenuous and clearly just about optics and how things look and maintaining a positive image and things of that sort. So it's not to say that all apologies are good and there's never an issue with apologies, but I do think when I look at relationships, when I'm as a therapist, even just personally, but as a therapist looking at families and couples, I think way more the issue is not enough genuine apologies rather than too many apologies, or that we should try to, we should never have to say sorry. I don't think that's realistic. So in the course of any close relationship, it's inevitable that you will do things that upset one another. The hope is that it's not intentional. So of course, you could be in a relationship where regularly people might harm each other intentionally, or things get so contentious, get so bad that let's say a couple, they're actually trying to upset the other person or want to hurt the other person. Of course, in a moment of anger, we might all feel that way for an instant, but generally speaking, you're hopefully in a relationship where you are not intentionally trying to harm one another. Things have gotten pretty bad when we get to that point. But even in a relatively healthy, happy relationship, still things will come up. It's just inevitable that you do things that upset one another. There's even smaller things like just annoyances. So if you're living with one another, spending time with one another regularly, interacting, doing activities together, sharing spaces, sharing activities, sharing things, different kinds together, then it's inevitable that, you'll sometimes want different things or will do things in a different way, or a person does something you don't like. So even in the smaller scale, there's just annoyances that come up, which doesn't mean, the person is doing something wrong, but that needs to be expressed. So that's more about the person expressing something they don't like or preferences that they don't, that they have. But then there are bigger things that will come up over the course of a relationship, things, as I often like to say it, that you do or don't do, because maybe it's you forgot to do something, or they wanted you to do something for them, or you forgot their birthday, let's say, or anniversary, or you forgot to do something. And often from things that you do, something you said, you made a joke to them, whether it's in person, just alone, or in public, in front of friends or other people, or you did something they didn't like. That's going to come up. And so I think it's important to accept that reality, because that can change the pressure that comes up that, if something happens, if someone is upset that something is really wrong. I think we should just acknowledge and accept that in any relationship, it's inevitable that things will come up. You did something I didn't like, or I did something you didn't like, something that happened hurt you, hurt me. That's just going to happen. We have to just expect and accept that reality. And when we do that, then it's a lot easier to face them, rather than, we should never upset each other. We should never get mad at each other. If we do, that means something is really wrong or bad, or one of us is really wrong or bad. It's like, no, this is just part of two people being in close connection and contact and relationship with one another. So first, just accept that. And if that's the case, then you should even think to yourself, even if your partner hasn't said anything to you, I must be doing things that they don't like. Because, as I'm saying, that's part of what's going to happen in relationships. It's not your job to read their mind, but I say that so you don't think if your partner brings something up, that's something really bad. It's like, well, of course. And of course, there should be things that you see from them that at times you don't like, whether they're small or big, or how regularly they happen. That's its own question, but that's just inevitable. So let's take some of that pressure off. Let's take some of that expectation or idealism away that a relationship is going to be just all good, or we won't upset each other, or I shouldn't get upset with you. That's just not realistic. So that's the first part. And even you can check in about that. I do think it's good for couples to talk often and regularly for sure. But on top of that, it could be nice to have whether it's kind of like a weekly check-in or however often you want to do it, or just check in about things. How are you doing? How are you feeling in the relationship? Has there been anything I've done lately or didn't do that you are unhappy about or don't like? Let's just put it all on the table, because what I see far too often, just like I see not enough apologies in general, just not enough communication, not enough talking about what's really going on. Just, we kind of get on autopilot, or think we just do the day-to-day things, but we don't really talk about what's going on. And I think that's unfortunately causes a lot of harm, because when problems are there, and they always will arise inevitably in any relationship, when we don't address any problem, it just gets worse. It just will fester and either get worse or linger or cause something damaging to the relationship. So I think it's important to just have that type of mindset that, of course, things will come up. So it's not like, oh no, something happened, something's wrong, I can't believe it. It's like, yeah, of course, something has come up. There's something we're feeling between us, that needs some resolving, because we're two human beings, and that makes sense. And so, coming to this idea of apologies, what I've noticed is, first of all, that people don't do it enough, but even when they do, there's sometimes this assumption that if you say I'm sorry, that should be the end of things, rather than recognizing saying I'm sorry is just the beginning of things. And so how do we see this? Well, people say, well, I'm sorry. And they might even say, well, I said I'm sorry. And almost like there's a sense that you can't be upset anymore because I said sorry. That's the end. You have to just forgive me and we move on. If you don't, that means you're the problem. You're the issue here, which is really messed up, because, if you're apologizing to someone, the mindset should be that I did something that hurt you and I feel bad about that, if you're actually sorry. So, I always think of this as, is the sorry about you or about them? If you're saying it just for yourself because you want forgiveness, so you don't, have to have some kind of guilt or feel like you owe them, or have to carry that burden of the guilt that you might feel. So that means the apology is about you. But if it's genuinely about them, that you feel bad that you hurt them, so you still have your feelings, but the focus is on them and how you've hurt them, that's a very different thing. So when people are focusing on themselves, the goal of the apology isn't to make sure the person feels right and the relationship feels right. It's to make sure we feel right. I want to feel like I've been forgiven. I don't want to have any guilt. I don't want this person mad at me. I want to be able to just move on, with that kind of peace of mind. And that's a bad place to start, because if I've hurt you, I can't make myself the priority. I've hurt you. I need to focus on you and how you're feeling, and to make things right in that way. So that's one thing we definitely have to recognize, is that if the first step is acknowledgement and apology, and that's really, really good, but it's not the final step, or it doesn't mean that things are over just because you've uttered the words, I'm sorry. But you often do see this, that it is this very clear indication that the goal is just forgiveness and losing the guilt and moving forward, rather than genuinely healing things and making things right. So you can say sorry. And even in how you say sorry, you want to make sure you're acknowledging the other person's feelings and not blaming them. Sometimes, the words I'm sorry might be in the apology, but it might not even be in the apology. Well, I'm sorry you're so sensitive, or I'm sorry, if you're hurt by that, or I'm sorry, but you did this, so I had to do that. Or, somehow blaming them for either being too sensitive and they got upset, or they caused you to get upset, and did something. But somehow, it's about them making the mistake, not you. So even if someone says the words "I'm sorry," it doesn't even mean it was an apology at all. It could be just using those words, but still another attack on that person. And actually, I said something there about, oh, you made me do this. A lot of people will do this, but definitely someone who has narcissism, but anyone with an anger issue or who has really hard time with their anger, you often will see this phrasing that they'll get very angry, maybe even got aggressive, maybe even cause kind of damage or physical assault or physical altercation. And rather than saying, I really lost my cool or I'm sorry, or feeling bad about having some kind of remorse for getting angry or losing their temper, what you actually will hear is that they'll say, can you believe how angry you made me? And I've heard this many times. And so sometimes it could be subtle, but sometimes it's very clear, but sometimes it's missed because it just seems like someone's talking about what happened. But there's this very clear indication that they're saying, you're to blame for my anger. You're the reason why I got upset. Or if I got that upset, can you imagine what you did that got me to that point, rather than taking any responsibility for it? If I lost my temper, yeah, maybe you did something I didn't like, but I'm responsible for how I respond to that. I can't just say, you did something, I'm allowed to react in any way that I do. And no matter how I react, that's all on you now because you did the thing that made me upset. But you do see that. So we have to be aware that just because we said the words I'm sorry doesn't mean that we've given an apology or we are making an apology. To me, a genuine apology has to first acknowledge our wrongdoing and focus on their pain and leave it at that. Now, of course, there are explanations and justifications and things that could come out that make sense. And even though sometimes can help, let's say if you were a little bit harsh with your partner after you came home, it might be good for them eventually know you had a really hard day at work. That might give some explanation. Now, it's not a justification that it's okay for you to take that out on them, that you're allowed to be mean to them because you had a bad day at work. That I don't think would be fair, but it might give them some sense that might soften the blow a bit of it. Okay, now I kind of get it. It was personal to me. I don't like it for you to take your stress at work out on me, but it might make it a little easier to swallow, even if it still is bitter, but it might make it a little bit easier. So those explanations aren't necessarily bad, or they don't, they could even add to the apology at some point. But if we open with those justifications or explanations, sometimes it can make it seem like we're trying to just, again, reduce the blame or remove the blame from ourselves and just say, okay, it's not my fault. I had a bad day at work, which usually does not feel very good to the other person, because then it just seems like they're at the mercy of how bad of a day you have at work. You're going to take it out on them, which I think most of us would agree. Yes, we're all going to have less patience if we are stressed. We're all going to be a little bit different if we had a bad day, but we do have to be mindful of not taking out our other difficulties on our loved ones and our partners. So you want to make sure you make it about their pain and your wrongdoing, and saying, let's go from there. So that's a good starting point. I'm Paul. Sorry for what I did. I could understand how that would be hurtful to you, and I'm sorry for that. So it's about your wrongdoing and their pain, and then you go from there. And what I'll do in the next, at least the next segment, is go a little bit more into some of the aspects or elements of what I think make for a good apology. And the first thing I'll say is the mindset. I was talking about before in a relationship, it's going to be imperfect. Things will come up. Inevitably, you do things that bother each other, upset each other. But one really important factor is that we can't be either, perfectionists about ourselves. We can't be super defensive about ourselves. We have to have the humility to acknowledge, I am human. I make mistakes. I get things wrong. I do wrong things. I do hurtful things, maybe even unintentionally at times, but even unintentionally. So you have to have that openness first. And some people don't have that. They don't want to acknowledge any wrongdoing, or have a very hard time accepting in any way that they did something wrong. And so if you have that, then you're always going to be on the defense and be defensive and not apologize. You might be someone who makes those types of apologies that could include the words I'm sorry, but are not apologies. So that's the first step, is we have to have that humility and that acknowledgement that I am human. This doesn't make me bad, but I do bad things, or I've done things that are hurtful even to my loved one. And so if we don't have that, we can only have the starting point. And so sometimes you have that, people who have that character or this type of characteristic, that it's hard for them, or they don't want to acknowledge doing anything wrong. And that can make it very hard for someone who's in a relationship with them, because there can be some sense that there will never be an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. So those are a few questions you can ask yourself. Am I even able to acknowledge? Am I too defensive not to acknowledge things? And if it might be hard for you to acknowledge that if you already are defensive, because you don't think you are being defensive. But anyway, we'll leave it at that. But after the break, I'll get a little bit more into the elements of what can make an apology meaningful and lead to resolution and reconciliation. Let's go to another commercial break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. In the previous segment, I was talking about making a good apology, genuinely saying sorry to it could be genuine, but to a loved one, something that I think is necessary in any relationship, because inevitably we will do things that upset or make the other person feel bad in some way. And it's important to repair those things. So often we see relationships over time get worse because of almost like this buildup or debris of these unresolved conflicts, issues. Many of them maybe even very small, but that buildup can over time lead to some big impact. So I was saying at first, what's important is to acknowledge what you have done without blaming them. So without excuses or without blaming the person for making you do what they did. So you're talking about your acknowledgement, I'm responsible, and then also recognizing how you've hurt them. So making about their feelings or how they've been negatively impacted by you. It can be important to also express remorse in some ways. So as I said, you want to make it about their feelings, but it doesn't mean don't put your own feelings, because often we do see that in a very disingenuous apology. We don't really think the person feels very bad. So genuine remorse, it should be real, but that can be important, not to make it about you, but to show that it does hurt you, that you hurt them, which I think most people would want to feel. This is another place where we can, as I was saying, this doesn't mean you're making it about you, but sometimes people do make it about them. Oh my God, you don't know how bad I feel. And then maybe the person starts crying or falling apart emotionally. Now the whole interaction becomes about them and how hurt they are and taking care of them rather than acknowledging or focusing on the pain of the person who's hurt. And so let's just think about that. If someone hurt someone else, yes, the person who hurt them might feel bad, but it would be, I think most of us would think, would be unfair or not right for the focus to be on the person who did the hurting. So if I punch you and my hand hurts, if we make it all about my hand and how much it hurts, that would seem a little bit unfair. I caused the damage. I caused the pain to both of us. So to make my pain the focus, or feel sorry for me, does seem a little bit unfair or not right. So yes, my hand might hurt from punching you, but I don't think that should be the focus. That's something that can be talked about. So you could mention, this is a little bit different when we're talking about hurting someone. I feel bad that I hurt you, not the actual pain from the direct, let's say, conflict. But feeling bad is important, but it can sometimes take away from that. Another important thing actually related to this acknowledgement or all those things is something more specific. I say this because I've sometimes worked with families or couples. Often I see this with parents, for example, who they are seeing their kids get older and they feel bad about maybe things they've done, or just they want to talk to them about things, or they want to try to make things right. And they'll might say, "I'm sorry for everything I did. I tried my best." And it's not an all bad thing. Obviously, there's something good in that. They're acknowledging wrongdoing, acknowledging that I know I made mistakes. That can be better than saying I've never made mistakes. And and if you're upset with me, that's your own fault. Or if you're hurt, that's your fault. Anything like that. But when it's such a blanket thing, like I'm sorry for everything, and I'm sorry for all the wrong things I did, although it sounds kind of good, the other person, can't do a lot with that because it's so general. And sometimes the way it's presented is that it does seem like it's more about just getting forgiveness and cleaning the slate rather than making things right. To make matters worse, the person might, get emotional while they say it. I'm so sorry for everything I've done. I really tried my best. And now they're crying. And, and I've seen this happen with parents apologizing to their kids. And again, it's a good thing for them to want to do that and to go into that. But if it's done in this way, in this very general way, and if that's one problem. So when it's not specific, it's hard to know what is it, everything I've done. But again, that sounds nice that you're saying it's so many things. You're acknowledging lots of wrongdoing, or acknowledging that you've done a lot of things. But when it's so vague, it's going to be difficult for the person to even know, feel something solid. Yes, there's something generally nice. Okay, you're acknowledging you did things that were hurtful and things, you could have done things better. But am I even sure what you did that hurt me? Am I clear that you understand what you did, why it was wrong, how to make it right, all of those things, you really can't get anywhere. So I think that's another important thing is sometimes it's obvious it just happens. You're saying, I'm sorry for what I said, you mean what you just said. But sometimes when we're going back or it's a relationship that's been many years or, parent-child kind of relationship, being specific, it has value. You might start with, I'm sorry for everything I did, but then it is important to get more specific because it's hard to resolve things when we stay in the very abstract or the vague or the general. So you want things to be specific. But as I was saying, when you express remorse, we might get the sense that, well, I want them to know how bad I feel, so, and hopefully it's all genuine, but, you want to know how bad you feel. You might think if I get even more emotional, if I express it so they really feel, like let's say you've cried about it before yourself. So let me cry about it when I tell them so they really know how bad I feel about this. On one level, that can seem nice or good that you're, wanting them to really know how much it's hurt you that they're hurt or how they, how hurt you feel that you've hurt them. That could be good. But if you get very emotional in the conversation, as I was saying before, now it could be more about making sure you're okay and your pain. I feel so bad for how I hurt you rather than I hurt you. Let's focus on your pain. So I've actually even coached some parents sometimes that when they, they say, I want to apologize to my son or daughter about things I did in their childhood, or I want to acknowledge some of those things that not that I want to remove their feelings or I want them to not get emotional. They're not allowed to feel things because that's something that I would promote. But I do think it's important to be able to contain your emotions. Yes, express some. It should be obvious that you do feel bad about it, but be able to contain it to the point where your loved one, especially if it's a son or daughter, your child, doesn't feel like they have to take care of you. You're so emotionally broken down about it. You're so emotional about it, they might feel like, oh, okay, I have to make sure my mom or dad is okay, rather than making sure, the conversations about what happened to them or how they were hurt by them. So that is something to keep in mind. When we're expressing remorse, or expressing how we feel bad about it, that if we show nothing, of course, that could feel weird if someone says, I feel so bad, but it feels very cold. You might feel like, do you actually feel bad? Because it doesn't sound like it. On the other hand, if we get overly emotional and get very intensely emotional, it could make it difficult for the conversation to be steered towards the person's pain that was hurt rather than your pain of, feeling bad about it. Obviously there's no recipe. I'm giving you some elements or some concepts to think about. It depends on so many factors. Obviously, how big the thing was that we did, how long ago it was, how impactful it was, if we've talked about it before. So many things can go into it. So I don't want you to think there's some recipe or rule book that you have to follow perfectly or that you can follow perfectly. It's more that there's some elements that are important to keep in mind, or some patterns that we can get into, sometimes that are not good, and ones that might be, more helpful. After we've acknowledged, we've, very clearly said what it is, being more specific, recognizing how we have hurt them, how they may be, were affected by it, expressing some level of remorse. I feel bad about it. Another important part is that there shouldn't be some sense or a pressure to forgive. And that's, opposite of what I was saying before, that sometimes when we apologize, some people will almost only be doing it for forgiveness. And when that's the case, well, that's not, to me, a genuine apology. It's not about them. It's about you. I don't want to have to feel bad, or I don't want to have to carry this burden or guilt, or I don't want to, have to live thinking that they're upset with me. I want to be able to just move on from it. So when we make a genuine apology, if we're really recognizing that we hurt the other person, then we would also understand that forgiveness is not automatic or immediate. So it's not like, I said, I'm sorry, I accepted, I expressed remorse, all those things, you should immediately feel okay. It can take some time, especially if it's, not only, but, especially if it's bringing up something old, it's been so entrenched, as feeling the pain, the hurt feelings, upset, all those kinds of things. We shouldn't imagine that you just saying a heartfelt apology will just magically make all those things disappear or just switch off. It would make sense that it's going to take some time. Time for that person maybe to process, think, time for you guys maybe to continue talking things out, to go deeper into it, to explore things, to have a back and forth. you want to give that person space. And so again, if you're making it about their feelings and their healing and the relationship's healing also, but emphasis on their pain, then you'll understand that there's no rush. You're not rushing them for forgiveness. You're here if they want to talk about it some more, but there isn't some sense that they should immediately be okay or feel good about things. So that's something that's very important. You might even express it very explicitly because you might understand. I know you might still be hurt or upset, or I know it might take some time, or I'm here if you want to talk some more about it, or if you need some time first, whatever it is, giving them that space to process or see what they need next. But it's very important to make it clear that forgiveness is not expected, especially not immediately and automatically. Um, Now, often I was talking about reparations and things in previous segments, but there's also important things about, trying to make things right, whether you can repair what happened. Sometimes, you said something yesterday, so you can't take back those words or you can't reverse it. Sometimes you can do something to try to make it up, make up for it. Sometimes it's more clearly something can be done. Oh, I didn't do something to help you. I'm going to do it tonight. I know it doesn't make up for yesterday, but I just want to do that tonight to make it right. And then related to that is a commitment to change, which sometimes, yes, we can't take back what we said yesterday or take back what we did previously, but we can express and then show, very importantly, that we are committing to some kind of change. I don't want to do this to you again. So if I'm really feeling bad about how I hurt you, I don't want to do that anymore. And so some people say the best apology is changed behavior. And I think that's really a good way of putting things, because we've all been there where someone has apologized to us, but they've done that thing again and again and again. And so the next time they apologize, it doesn't feel so much like I'm really sorry, because we don't see, or we might not feel like there's an effort to make a change. And so it just feels like you're just saying sorry to, get out of it this time, but maybe you'll do it again. So how do I trust or feel good about you and feel good about this relationship that you won't hurt me in that way again? Because you've shown me that history has shown me that it doesn't seem like you want to make a change or you're able to make a change, and that doesn't feel good. Not to knock on any kind of religious experiences, but sometimes people can feel this way about confession, that people will do something bad and then they confess that makes things clear, and they go do that bad thing again, knowing that they can confess again and be absolved of the guilt and absolved of the sin. So it doesn't really feel like they feel bad about what they did. It just feels like they have this way, to get out of jail free, get out of guilt free card that they're going to use. And so, yeah, they'll just go and do the thing they know is bad, but without any feeling like there's any consequences. So that is a really important part about an apology, is that we want to see some kind of effort. I mean, we want to see the change, but then also sometimes like effort that's made. So someone will say, well, I'm going to therapy, or I'm working on this. And that doesn't excuse it. I think sometimes I do think that could be not a cop-out, but excuse. People say, well, I'm self-aware, or I'm talking about it in therapy. And that could be some kind of effort, but sometimes we need to make more of an effort to actually change the behavior. Sometimes people can use that almost as an excuse. Well, if I'm talking about it in therapy, then you can't be mad at me. Or if I'm self-aware, I've actually heard this a lot too, this sense that if you're aware of what you're doing, somehow it makes it okay, which is not the case. Sometimes that can even be worse. If you're aware of what you're doing or why you do it, but you don't change it, that could possibly be worse than if you didn't know. But I think, unfortunately, therapy language and going to therapy, as much as that's a good thing, sometimes it can be abused. And this is one of the ways that people will do that. I'm working on this, so you can't be mad at me, or, I'm working on this, so I'm almost excused to act out in this way or do what I'm doing. So it can be very important for us to make it clear that, if, again, because it can make those other parts not feel genuine. If you genuinely acknowledge what you did is wrong, you genuinely feel bad about it and feel like you're responsible, if you recognize the impact it had on them negatively in hurting them, if you, don't want to do it again, then if you don't make any effort to change or show that, can feel like it's not very real. And that's why when people repeatedly do the same hurtful thing, people very regularly say, it doesn't feel like your sorry is genuine. I don't feel like you actually feel bad, because it seems like, again, you just want to get out of the guilt or get out of the burden of it, but want to keep doing that same wrong or bad thing. And so these are just some elements or thoughts on apologies, what can make them more genuine or heartfelt or real, and then lead to hopefully things getting better. But what I'll talk about a bit after the break is how um, these apologies not just to apologize and that's it, and get through that one thing, but how it actually can make relationships stronger. Because I think avoiding conflict creates lots of problems in relationships, unfortunately. And recognizing that embracing and facing conflicts that actually genuinely make our relationships stronger and better is something very important to think about. So let's go to another commercial break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. In the previous segment, I was talking about apologies, how we can try to give genuine apologies, what that even means, some of the elements of a genuine apology. And I mentioned before the break how apologies, can be part of a healthy relationship, or I think are necessary for a healthy relationship, because conflicts are an inevitable part of a relationship, and resolving conflicts is a necessary part of maintaining a healthy and happy relationship. And so this brings back this point that I was making earlier, that that we'll have to apologize at some point in a relationship, that conflict is inevitable in a relationship. So so I say it's not about if you fight, it's how you fight, but also it's not about if you have conflict, it's how you handle conflict. It has to be there. You're two people. You will not always want the same things, see things the same way. You'll inevitably do things that bother one another, upset one another. That is just has to happen in any relationship. So we have to remove this fiction that if I'm with my soulmate, there will never be any issues. If I'm in a good relationship, we'll never have problems. We'll always be happy. We'll never upset each other. Those things are just fairy tales. They're not actual relationships. And this is why when I think of, there's so many gifts that parents can give their kids, from how they love them, how they treat them, how they treat one another, so many things. One very important one that can at times get overlooked is handling conflict in a healthy way. Much, much, much easier said than done, but it's important to keep this in mind, that um, how and handling, and also how we relate to conflict, but doing that in a healthy way. The reason why I add how we relate to conflict is because in so many families, the way conflict is dealt with is that it's avoided as much as possible. So that itself shows an unhealthy relationship with conflict, that it treats conflict as this very scary thing, this thing to be avoided at all costs if possible. And unfortunately, the message that this sends to kids and they start to learn is that conflicts are really scary, because it could mean the relationship ends, or I lose love, or I lose loved ones, or people no longer like me or want to be with me, or they get so mad that they go away, or whatever it is. But there's a sense that conflict isn't some inevitable part of a relationship. Conflict is the potential end of a relationship. It's a very scary and terrifying thing. So this is what I see in most families, is the way that they're dealing with conflict is they try to avoid it. And it's kind of this 0-1, almost like a binary, that avoid, avoid, avoid until you have some blow up fight, which also happens because you avoid, you hold things in, tensions build because things don't get resolved. And so when things finally come out, they come out in this very ugly way. So it further reinforces this idea that conflict is a very scary thing. We avoid it because it's so scary. Then when you finally see its face, it's a very scary thing. And so I think most families are unfortunately teaching their kids this pattern, that conflict is very scary, conflict is so bad, conflict is to be avoided at all costs. So, hold in your feelings. If you're upset about something, it's better not to say anything. If you don't like something, just try to deal with it. If you don't like someone, maybe just avoid them. All of these ways of avoiding conflict, avoiding people we have conflict with, that is unfortunately the message that I think most families are getting. Or also that conflict is about winning and losing. So if you're upset with, once it finally comes out, usually it's about punishing the other person, proving them wrong, proving yourself right, or as the victim, and the other person as the bad person. Conflict is treated not as this inevitable part of healthy relationships, but as something that comes up at really bad times and makes things into this me against you battle. Winner takes all. We're not together anymore. We're fighting against each other. I think that's a really horrible thing, because the alternative is we can show our kids, and we have to show this not just through words but by actions, that conflicts will come up. We'll have disagreements, and I'm not trying to also here be idealistic that you'll have conflicts and everyone's just smiling and everything is happy, and it's even when you're upset, having a fight, no one gets upset or anything. That's not realistic either. Some feelings will come up. We're not trying to be robots or create this very like sanitized view of life or experience of life for our kids. But feelings might come up, but they feel very under control. So we don't have to be scary for the kids. But there is expression of things. I don't feel good, or I didn't like this, I was upset. So we talk about it. But we want to show them that it's not that we never fight, we never get upset, but that things come up and we talk about it, and it actually can make things better. We can have resolution. So you want to encourage them to tell you things also. So if they bring up something, you don't want to say things like, oh, like, why are you causing problems? Or, oh, just be happy, or you shouldn't be worried about this, or whatever it is. You want to reinforce and encourage your kids that if they tell you something, if they're upset about something, they don't like something, they're always allowed to say that. They're always allowed to tell you what they don't like, what they're feeling. And doesn't mean they just get what they want no matter what, but that it's always going to be listened to, and it's always welcomed for them to say what they're feeling. So you want to definitely reinforce that directly with them. And then also, as partners, show that to them, that you guys will talk about things, express things, and show them that conflict is not something to be feared. I think this is a really big gift to give your kids, and to keep that in mind, to think what type of conception of conflict am I sharing with my kids? Am I, are they inheriting from me? Are they observing from us and we have in this home? I think it's much better to make it that we're a kind of family that talks about things, that doesn't shy away from problems or conflicts. Everyone is allowed to express what they're feeling. We do it with respect, care, and kindness, but everyone is allowed to express what they're feeling and to have the conversation with one another about whatever it is that's on their mind, to give them that sense, that psychological safety, that that's how things are in this home. And that conflict doesn't mean, yelling and screaming. Conflict doesn't mean, the end of relationships. Conflict is part of all relationships. That's going to be part of our home, because that's part of every home. And so that they know that if you have an argument or disagreement, this is not something bad, or the beginning of the end, or something horrible that's about to happen. It's just something that will happen, that has to happen in any kind of family, any kind of relationship. So I think that's something important to keep in mind, because what I see happen is that people do fear conflict. I think I've experienced that myself personally. It's something that I've tried to get better with, but it's a challenge, of embracing conflict and not seeing it as something that should be avoided, something that we should fear. Because really, conflicts, it's not some kind of cliche thing that they make us get closer, they're good, so it's not one of these things where now that we say everything that you think is bad is good in some kind of idealized way. It really is something that leads to, when dealt with in a healthy way, the betterment of a relationship. So how might that be so? Why would dealing with conflict and facing it, embracing it, actually, how could it make a relationship stronger? It can almost seem puzzling. You might think if we don't fight, that's a good thing. And of course, this is not to say all conflict is good. You can have very toxic, harmful ways of conflict coming up, people being aggressive and abusive and manipulative and hurtful. So there's definitely no sense. I don't want to, again, go that other extreme of saying all conflict is good or it's always a good thing. Absolutely not. Conflict can lead to the deterioration of a relationship or the ending of a relationship. There really is, that significant part of having and maintaining respect, and being able to keep things under control. And importantly, it's not just about conflict starting, it's about resolving them, repairing them. That is really crucial and critical to make sure that they actually do have a positive rather than negative impact. So I want to go through some different ways that conflict can actually be helpful. One thing that's really important when we think about conflict and the avoidance of conflict is that when we avoid conflict, we don't really get to know each other as well as we can. because I don't really know what you're thinking and feeling, what your preferences are, what you don't like, what you would like us to do, not to do, if we are avoiding conflict. But if we are okay expressing, needs, preferences, sensitivities, insecurities, triggers, whatever it might be to one another, then we can get closer. And this is often what happens when we have a conflict. And just this mindset that when we have a conflict, it's not me against you, it's us. This is something that's come up. Let's try to understand each other better, understand our relationship better. Your partner says something that you don't like. Now, if it's very me against you, it's this, oh, you said this really horrible thing, you're bad. I'm allowed to be mad or hurt at you, and you're the bad person. But when we have a better sense of the relationship or about conflict, we can say, I got hurt by this, but I could recognize that, obviously it could have been something really bad that they said, but there also is part of me that's here too. Maybe my insecurity got triggered here. Maybe something for me came up. And that's something that does come up often. One person says something, another person gets hurt. And if they bring it up, what you said hurt my feelings. And if they don't, the other person doesn't get defensive, they can actually get somewhere to better understand, oh, you know what, this brings up, the way you said that is kind of like what my mom used to say, or I used to get bullied or teased for this part of myself that you thought you were making a harmless joke about, but actually it hurts because I've been, hurt on this topic a lot of times. And so this actually allows for a better understanding of each other. That the person says, oh, I didn't know that. And often, someone, if they're in a good relationship, they might make a joke and it hurts the other person. They said it because they actually don't think it's something so bad about them. They thought it was just funny or playful to say it. So they would have never thought it's such a big thing. But now they understand, oh, for you, this is something that you feel insecure about or bad about. And I understand you better. And yeah, maybe even you get into the history of, oh, yeah, this is what kids used to say at school, or this is what happened to me, or my mom or dad talked to me in this way, or whatever it is. Now it's an opportunity to better understand each other. It's like, okay, now I get you more or more deeply, right? I understand, I know things about your past and your history and about who you are now. And I don't want to hurt you in that way. It's kind of like, if you find out, oh, that your partner has a bad elbow, okay, you'll be careful not to bump into that elbow because it's more sensitive than their other elbow or other parts of their body. Now I know this topic is more sensitive for you, or these kinds of ways of phrasing things can be hurtful to you. So if we avoid the conflict, your partner wouldn't get to learn those things about you. If you just held it in or thought, oh, no, I don't want to create a fight, or, oh, it's just about me, or I don't want to make them upset, or maybe they'll get mad at me if I bring it up, all these things that might make us avoid it, you would actually avoid getting closer. That's why I often like to think of, avoiding conflict as avoiding closeness. If we avoid conflict at all costs, it's not just that you're avoiding conflict and you think, okay, that's a good thing. You're actually avoiding closeness in your relationship. And if you look at any relationship you have in your life, if conflict is always avoided in that relationship, it likely isn't a very close relationship. For us to have a genuinely close relationship, we have to be able to have conflict, because both people can't fully be in a relationship if there never is conflict. There's no space for conflict, because we have to at times get upset by things, or things will inevitably come up. So if we're avoiding conflict, that means we're somehow not bringing our whole selves into it. So that's one important thing, is that there is a better understanding that develops over time if we are okay with um, having conflict. Another thing related to that is that we feel more secure in the relationship over time, which sounds almost counterintuitive. We think, well, if we're having more conflicts, we should feel less secure. And of course, if you're having really ugly conflicts, or it's constant, or any of those things, that's not good. So as I said, it's not to glorify conflict as it's an amazing thing. It can still be very hurtful. But you get more trust in a relationship and in your partner over time if you have these conflicts that you see go okay. Okay, we talk about things, and yeah, it can be a little bit uncomfortable while it's happening, or when we're in the heat of the moment, but then I feel a lot better afterwards. And that feels good. And it makes me not as afraid of the next potential conflict. Because if we avoid conflict at every cost, it could kind of feel like we're walking on thin ice, that if anything is to crack, everything's going to break and we're going to fall into this freezing water. Then we're barely making it because we're avoiding conflicts, we're avoiding these landmines. And if we step on one, everything explodes. But if we've had many conflicts and conversations that were uncomfortable and brought up feelings and brought up ways that we hurt one another, well, now if we've resolved those things peacefully and amicably and they've gone fairly well, it gives us this confidence in each other and in the relationship that, okay, we can face these things. I'm not so afraid of something coming up because I know we'll handle it. We'll get past that one too. But if we never have, that could be really terrifying to feel like, okay, our next fight could be the last, which is what many people might feel in their relationship. So again, avoiding conflict avoids closeness. It actually avoids us from getting closer to one another. So after the break in the last segment, I'll just add a few more thoughts or a few different ways, for a few more ways that actually embracing conflict and handling it in a healthy way can lead to the betterment, the strengthening of a healthy and happy relationship. So let's go to our last commercial break. We'll be right back. So before the break or the previous segment, I was talking about how resolving conflict, having healthy conflict in a relationship actually strengthens the relationship, which it can seem obvious. I'm saying, handling it well will lead to it, strengthening. But the important point is that for many of us, the thought of conflict makes us think the relationship won't survive or the relationship can't handle that conflict. So I mentioned that before the break, that just handling conflict and having good conversations or having them not go really bad is itself going to create more trust and comfort and security in the relationship, because there's a sense that we can have things come up, we can express things to one another, but it doesn't mean something ugly or something bad. It actually can go quite well. And I should say, there is some risk with conflict. I don't want to make it seem like either it's good or it's bad, or you have it in your, things will always be good in your relationship, or some people just do it in a bad way. That we talk about things that come up in a relationship, we can get emotional. So they won't always be clean, even in the healthiest of relationships. They won't always go well. You'll sometimes have a conversation that doesn't go well. So this isn't about perfection. This isn't about either you always get it right or you always get it wrong. It's about hopefully more times than not, where you build this confidence over time. Just like no one's going to be perfect, but you might still rely on them or feel that they're a reliable person. So I was saying that, you can get to understand each other better. That was one important thing that, that the relationship will build over time. Also, a very important one is that you have less anger or resentment in the relationship, because what most people do in most relationships have is unresolved conflicts. Someone did something you didn't like, but you didn't say anything, and you gave yourself reasons why you shouldn't. And, people think, well, if something happened in the past, that means that, the feelings will go away, but the feelings don't just disappear. If someone hurts you and you just have to hold on to those feelings and you didn't get to express it and it didn't get resolved, well, unfortunately, that feeling will still be there. Doesn't mean it's always there or it's always going to be at the forefront, but it'll stay there. And if we have the buildup of these things over time, unfortunately, that resentment, that anger will build, and that can change how you feel about one another. When you look at a relationship and how two people feel about one another, there's a general feeling that you have about your partner, a complex one, but there's something that you feel. It could be overall a more loving, kind, trusting feeling. It could be one of anger, or one even of the sense of, I have to protect myself from my partner because they might hurt me, and I have to be kind of aware of that. So there's a feeling that you have, and I see this with couples when I work with them, that you could tell, where is the relation, where is that underlying feeling? So, a couple might have the same fight or about, a fight about the same thing, but the way it goes will be very different based on how they feel about each other underneath, or, everything building up to that conflict. So you said that thing that hurt me. And if you have this feeling that your partner is someone that is negative, that doesn't like you, that wants to hurt you, that is against you in a lot of ways, well, then when you have this latest fight, you're going to have, you're going to come out guns blazing, trying to protect yourself, trying to attack them. But if you have a very loving, strong, secure feeling with your partner, then you have that same, situation. You might feel hurt by what they said or what they did, but it'll be a lot easier for you to come towards them rather than to attack them, to try to make things better. So this is also why how you feel about someone is so important. So people say, well, we have a communication issue. And they think as long as we learn like the right words and phrases, we're going to be okay because we don't communicate well. So if, sometimes a therapist will teach you I statements, say, I feel this way. Talk about your feeling rather than saying you did this or you're bad or whatever it is, focus on your feelings. And that can be helpful. But the problem is when, if there's a lot of anger or hurt or pain in the relationship, even if you use the right words or you think you're using these kinds of phrases that will make things better, it won't change how you feel about one another. Over time, you'll say the I statements, but it might start becoming, I think you're an idiot. You might start turning them into attacks because there is such an anger there that it's not just about using the right words. What's important is having the right feeling between two people. And then, yes, the words and phrases does matter, but all the, flowery language in the world is not going to cover up the bad scent of a bad relationship. When two people have anger and resentment towards one another and have that bitterness, then the nice words won't make a difference because they won't go very far. So we need to address our conflicts in a relationship because we don't want this resentment to build either. So it helps build some good things and also removes some bad things. And that's one of the bad things that can build up in any relationship. And I've seen it so many times with couples that there is this resentment and this upset feeling over the years of things that have not been dealt with. And unfortunately, sometimes it can really start to kill the love that is between two people to the point where it can be hard to bring that back, hard to resuscitate that fire or that flame. So that's also something very important. When you address conflict, and I was saying, you also get more emotional safety, but you also get some sense of repairing things. So, something happens, you get hurt by what the person did. And, when you work on it, you then can come to a better place together. And now, even if things went bad in that situation, you can feel stronger for having gone through it. So this isn't to suggest you should try to create conflict. That's one of those things that you don't have to try to create conflict. It's going to come up if you're being real with one another. You don't have to try to create conflict thinking, oh, this is going to make us stronger. But when it does, recognizing that this can be an opportunity for us to get closer can also make it a bit easier to face and embrace the conflict. That, okay, this doesn't feel good, but I do believe that if we handle this well, if we approach this with kindness and respect, that we can get to a better place and actually get stronger because of this. An important piece I was saying, get to a better place, something that we might think in conflict is that we have to think exactly the same thing, or we have to get to the exact same place. And that's ideal. It does happen sometimes, but a lot of times we don't totally get there. And what we want to start with is recognize that the first part is understanding. It's not necessarily agreement, but understanding. I want to at least understand, what you felt or what you went through, or even how you, felt during our fight or understood our fight. Because I so often deal with couples who are sharing about a fight they had, the week before, and they're both shocked at how the other person told the story. Like, no, that's not at all what happened, or that's not at all what you said, or whatever it might be. And so what I try to tell them is like, for me to know, I won't know exactly what happened anyway, so we can kind of mitigate this and try to prove who was right or wrong, but it probably won't get us very far. What's likely happening is that you guys have different experiences of what happened and different understandings of what happened. And that might be even more important than really trying to boil down, did you say this word or that word, or who said what first? Trying to understand each other's experience of it. So that's really one important thing when it comes to conflict is there can be this automatic reaction to try to prove yourself right and to win. Well, you want to try to let down that guard and remember that it's not me against you, it's us together. I'm not trying to win against you. I'm trying to resolve this conflict with you, not against you. And so because of that, I don't have to prove my point or try to prove the facts. I want to make sure I understand you and you understand me. That, we were both there for this argument, but we will likely have different memories of it. We'll likely have very different experiences of it. And that's what's important to talk about. And in general, just understand, okay, I want to understand you, not necessarily will I even agree. Sometimes we might feel different. Someone says, I got hurt when you said this, and you might try to understand why it hurt them, but you might not agree that that same thing would hurt you. And you don't have to. You don't want to make that the focus, but it doesn't mean you have to feel the same as them about everything. You're two people, so you're going to have different kinds of responses and experiences to things, and that's okay. That's to be expected. But the important part is that understanding doesn't mean total agreement. Total agreement is not necessarily likely. And even related to that, I'll bring up something on John Gottman, who has done decades of research on couples and seeing what makes marriages work, what leads to divorce. He even says that many conflicts or many of the issues that couples have never get resolved, which kind of sounds puzzling. And this is even in good relationships, healthy relationships, the relationships that last. That we often think, okay, we're going to have a conflict and we're going to get to some resolution where everyone feels really good about this. And we close it completely. It's neat. It's processed. It's done. We move on. But he says from what he's found is that I forgot the percentages now, so I won't say it, but there is a fairly sizable percentage of conflicts that don't get resolved. They're just kind of always there between a couple, like one of them is always late, another one is on time, and they fight about it, when they have to go somewhere, when things come up, or they're trying to meet each other, or whatever it might be. And so ideally, they find some resolution, some perfect compromise. Okay, the one who's a little bit late gets a little bit earlier. The one who's on time is okay being a little bit late or whatever. And they find some exact healthy medium. But that doesn't always happen. And that's not always going to happen. And that's okay, which I think is really important to keep in mind. And to me is another reminder of conflict not having to be some scary thing, that even if you can't find a solution or find some perfect resolution, that doesn't mean that the relationship is doomed or this has to be harmful or hurtful to the relationship. So what he says is, with those kind of unresolvable conflicts, that we still maintain respect when we have these conversations. For sure, that's always going to be there. Disrespect is just a poison for any relationship. So the respect is there. There's some sense of mutual understanding, and there's even some way that we try to deal with this issue that doesn't get resolved in a way that minimizes the harm to our relationship, but it's going to still be there. We have to keep going places, and we're just going to disagree about when we have to go, or one of us will be later than the other one, and we'll have to find a way to deal with that, because it's going to come up. So I think that's also important to keep in mind, that not all conflicts do get resolved, and that is okay. So I think that's an important point to make sure we don't get idealistic about conflict. I was saying we don't want to say, oh, all conflict is good, or it's never a bad thing, or we should always be happy about it, or it's always going to feel good. No, not at all. It can be harmful. It can feel really bad when you're in it. Even in a good relationship, you're sometimes going to handle it poorly. All those things that can lead to damage in the relationship, that's definitely there. And they won't always even get resolved. You might have the conversation and still feel like, nope, this feels like it's kind of unfinished. And so it might always feel like unfinished business between you and your partner, but that can be okay, as long as you maintain mutual respect, try to have mutual understanding, and try to together come up with a way to minimize any kind of damage or negative effect it has on the relationship, that it doesn't turn to, let's say, some kind of power struggle, or constantly trying to prove the other one wrong. You find some way to minimize the negative impacts that it has. So over time, what also will happen in all these things that I'm saying is that your sense of we can start to grow. If you embrace conflict, face conflict together, go through it together, go through those hard parts together, it can strengthen the relationship by making you feel like your relationship is stronger, that you together are stronger. I was mentioning before that you become less afraid of conflict, and because of that, there's more of this sense of togetherness. One, we've had many battles and fought many battles together, even sometimes against each other in a way. Or at least we were upset with each other, but we fought together in the end. And the sense that we can face more things together. So we've gone through them and we can go through more. So your sense of connection and intimacy will only grow. And if there's this feeling that I can tell you things that are uncomfortable, or I can bring up things that you might not like to initially hear, that also creates more intimacy. So I was saying avoiding conflict means avoiding closeness. And if we embrace conflict, we're more likely to be able to embrace more closeness and intimacy in our relationship. So, I started this conversation talking about the importance of apologies and having a good apology. And overall, the sense that conflict is something that I think most families, as I said, don't handle well. And because of that, teach their kids that conflict is a bad thing, a scary thing, and don't give them tools for how to handle it. But it is something so important to think about. And as always, when I talk about these things, I know it's kind of this abstract way, but I would encourage anyone listening, as I try to do myself, to think about yourself. What's your own relationship with conflict? What was conflict like in your home? What lessons did you learn about conflict, good and bad? And how do you deal with conflict in your relationships, especially in your closest relationships? Because it's going to impact it, whether you avoid it or not, it's there. So that brings us to the end of today's show. A big thank you to Farid in the studio. You've been listening to In Session with Dr. Farid Holakouee, Free Iran.